and welcome back to State of the Division, this time bringing you UFC 309 for the big fight that's a bit past its expiration date. Yes, admittedly, I'm a little bitter about this fight happening in general, my enthusiasm as such is dampened. But to be somewhat optimistic about this card instead of just being a downer, there do look to be some interesting fights scattered throughout. You have various degrees of contenders and newcomers scattered throughout the early prelims and prelims. Not to mention we have Paul Craig versus Bo Nickal, which I think is a great litmus test for Bo Nickal, and a chance to launch himself in that title contention picture. Oliveira Chandler should be a great fight just because Chandler always looks to put on dog fights whenever he goes in, and Oliveira really needs a win, so I think we're getting two guys who kind of know they need to leave it all out there. Weidman Anders looks to be a dirty pleasure fight for me, along with Tybura stepping into the octagon, which I think should be interesting as well. But before we talk about all that, we got to do some housekeeping and the Butcher's Bill. For housekeeping, I went 10-3 in the last card, which I think overall is my best record ever doing this. That does bring my overall record to a really nice 92, 56, and 2, which does mean 100 correct predictions is in sight. Now, for the Butcher's Bill, it gets a little bit more complicated. Firstly, axed off the card completely, it was Anthony Smith versus Dominic Reyes. Completely off the card, you will not see either fighter. Also off the card completely is Nikita Krylov versus Azamat Murzakanov, which I'd already written half of this when I realized it was off the card. This is due to one of them having to pull out. I'm unsure which fighter had to pull out or why they had to pull out. Either way, it's off the card. Then we have a little bit of an odd one. David Onama versus Lucas Almeida. Almeida was being forced to pull out due to undisclosed reasons, at least as far as I looked. However, Sherdog still listed Onama as having a fight on the card, so I imagine the UFC might be looking for a replacement, but I haven't officially seen anything either way at the time of writing, and I'm not waiting any longer to record this. So in the end, the Butcher's Bill is 3 total fights. Anthony Smith, Dominic Reyes, Nikita Krylov versus Mirzakov, and David Onama versus Lucas Almeida. All of those are off the card as far as I'm concerned. Opening up the card, 9-4-1, Veronica Hardy looks for 4 in a row against 10-1, Eduarda Ronda Moura. Hardy is 1 year younger, but Moura is at least 2 inches taller with another 2 in reach heading her way. Hardy comes in as a ground-focused grinder who tends to keep the fight close and rely on small differences in order to get the win. That being in terms of the ground game, she works a 1.08 takedown average, which can be turned into chunks of control time, but isn't always. In her last 2 fights, both of which are wins, she had less total ground control time and at best tied the total takedowns of the fight, but as a whole was able to take the minor edge over 3 rounds to get the win. Looking at her striking, she has a grappler ratio, a 3.13 to 3.75, which really speaks to her reliance on dictating the ground or just eking out those wins by very narrow margins. She has been outpaced on the feet in addition to being susceptible to the finish, but she hasn't lost by finish since 2019, her only loss since then coming by decision. Moura is a relative newcomer with 3 fights on record with 1 Contender Series win, 1 regular win, and 1 loss. Stylistically, she's another ground-heavy fighter with some major finish ability, stacking takedowns in each of her UFC wins. In terms of the ground game, she works a 5.15 takedown average with emphasis on controlling when the fight goes to the ground with a 100% takedown defense. She does tend to finish her fights, but the 5 minutes of ground control in her last win does show how she uses that time to work from an advantageous position. In striking, she works a 3.09 to 2.10, which has been converted to some KO ability, but it's somewhat dependent on that takedown game being a threat and keeping her opponent wary. Vegas gives the narrow edge to Hardy, and I will disagree. My main reasoning here is that Moura is very heavy on the takedowns, and while Hardy has a 60% takedown defense, we saw her get controlled on the ground soundly in her first 3 UFC fights. And I believe that Moura is capable of stacking up enough takedowns to limit what Hardy wants to do and her ability to execute her game plan, which put the ball in Moura's court and gives her more chances to land her submission or even simply rack up control time, which she's proved she can do already. 9-4-1 Basil the Habibi Hafez looks to build a streak against 11-2 Oba, Welsh gangster Elliot. Elliot is 6 years younger, either dead even height across the board or 1 inch to Elliot, with the reach being dead even across the board. Fez is a newcomer to the UFC, but if I'm trying to peg a style, he's very much a grinder with some submission ability. Career totals of 4 submission and 4 decision wins helping that idea along. On the ground, he carries a 3.0 takedown percentage, which he uses to great effectiveness in putting control of the fight in his wheelhouse. And backing that up is his looming submission threat. Now, his striking is somewhat skewed due to his loss against Jack Della Maddalena, where he was outstruck 83-32, and that does help explain the 4.23 to 5.53 average he has in striking. And very much, it does seem to be just good enough to support his takedowns and keep him in fights most of the time. Elliot's a 3-fight veteran in the UFC, 2 regular and 1 contender series fight, and honestly he's very similar to Hafez in terms of style. A lot of emphasis on the control game and large chunks of control time to take the fight the distance. In the ground game he carries a 2.67, and even with only 1 takedown took about 5 minutes of control time. Once again he has a grappler striking total with 3.82 to 2.24, which shows how he doesn't always have these high striking totals. His highest in the UFC was 70, and that fight didn't even break 100 total significant strikes across both fighters. Open Elliot gets the Vegas nod here, and while it's close, I will agree. Obviously, I'm banking on Elliot being able to match Hafez on the ground, which I think he can. Additionally, if you look at Elliot's track record in the UFC, he's successfully been able to land multiple takedowns in a fight and rack up those chunks of control time. With Hafez, you don't always see those multiple takedowns, and we've seen him get controlled a little bit before. I think Elliot's good enough to match him on the ground, and his ability to land multiple takedowns and dictate when it goes to the ground, when he's on top, when he's in control, I think gives him the opportunity to get the points he wants and finish the fight his way, namely going to decision. 7-6, McGhee Gall looks for the rebound against 10-5, Brahimaj. I'm so sorry. Brahimaj is a whole year younger at 31, 4 inches shorter, with 2 inches in reach, also going to Gall. Now, Gall is riding a 3-fight losing streak, and if I'm looking to describe a style, it's very much a submit or lose style. Not even so much a kill or be killed, but if he doesn't get the early submission, he loses the fight by either getting finished or getting decisioned. On the feet, he runs a 3-3-3 to 4-5-5, which isn't uncommon for grapplers and ground-focused fighters, and that will be a common theme this card. But he seems to lack any sort of real finishing power on the feet. Striking seems only to exist to let him get to the ground. On the topic of the ground, he has a 1.18 takedown average, and given his nature to finish, he doesn't really stack, looking to work off a single takedown for the finish. He has been outpaced on the ground before, which has resulted in him getting controlled in turn. Brahimaj, once again, so sorry, has been a bit streaky so far in the UFC. Stylistically, it's very similar to Gall with how he goes for the quick submission win, and without it, tends to get decisioned. On the ground, he carries a 1.61, which does reflect how he tends to land a takedown a fight, with most of his success coming off that single takedown. In 2 of his 3 UFC losses, he was taken down 5 times while only landing 1 takedown, ending in a decision loss. Striking also sits as that grappler style at 1.74 to 3.69, where it exists only to be good enough to let him get to the ground. Vegas gives the narrowest of nods to Gall, and I'm going to disagree. Admittedly, I am a little shaky on this one, but my logic is that we've seen Gall get taken down and get controlled, and Brahimaj has proven to be a submission artist very capable of sinking the submission when given the chance. Gall needs to sink a submission out well, but we've seen Brahimaj survive 5 takedown attempts, not get submitted, and take the fight to the end. So I don't know if Gall is going to be able to control Brahimaj enough, and Brahimaj is going to have more chance to sink a submission or even take control time, which we've seen him do. Taking us out of the early prelims, 25-9, Tybura looks to put a stop to 8-0 Diniz's undefeated streak. Diniz is 6 years younger at 33, 1 inch taller with another inch in reach, also going his way. Tybura is a little bit of an odd duck stylistically, but as a whole I would call him a grinder with some finishability. His last 3 wins went 2 decision and 1 submission win, with a career total of 9 KO, 7 submission, and 9 decision wins, so you can kind of see he's a little over the place. He seems to make good use of takedown game and the associated control time with a 1.42 average. Plus, I have to mention his ability to sink submissions off some of his takedowns, though he only has 1 of those in the UFC. Now, he doesn't tend to stack takedowns, but tends to utilize his 1 for a good chunk of control time. Backing all that up is some lumbering power and a heavyweight striking average of a 3.57 to a 3.34. It is counterable, as he has been beat on the feet, both by the finish and simply being overwhelmed. Diniz is the newcomer here, with only 3 UFC fights, 2 regular, 1 contender series, but as a whole is very much a power puncher who's more than willing to step in and exchange and to let his power be the decider. Looking at the UFC numbers, he works a 409 to 275 in the striking, which does highlight how he's able to pour it on without the finish. He's got a .00 takedown average and was taken down twice in his last fight, though obviously he did get a win. The narrow edge goes to Tybura, and I will agree. A little bit of this is a bias to ground fighters, and a little bit of this is also giving Tybura the narrow edge because of his experience against other higher ranked heavyweights. I don't know how good Diniz is. I haven't watched him fight. However, I have watched Tybura fight, and that's very much what I'm basing this decision off of. I know how Tybura fights, and I think Tybura's takedown game and his power in that regard can put Diniz on the back foot and put him in a disadvantaged situation. However, on the feet, Diniz very well could have the edge and could have the power advantage, given that Tybura tends to be a bit more lumbering with his power, relying on heavy punches landing flush. Truthfully, this fight is a bit of a toss-up, but I am going to give the edge to Tybura kind of based on his experience and that ground game, although the age might also be a problem. Alright, so this may or may not be the actual start of the prelims. Either way, 37, 18, 0-1. Jim A10 Miller looks to rebound against the 23, 7, 1-1. Damon Action Jackson. Jackson is 5 years younger at 36, 3 inches taller, with reach coming out to a dead draw across the board. Miller is an old hand in the UFC. His first fight coming in 2008, I think I best can call him a submission finisher who's more than willing to grind. I know that's a weird way to put it, but he has a majority of wins by finish, submission especially, but he did have spurts where he had to grind his way to the end. So while his last 5 fights are all wins by finish, 3 KO, 2 submission, he doesn't need the finish to win and is more than capable of grinding it to the end. All that being said, his takedown percentage is a 1.53, which speaks to his consistency at landing at least a takedown a fight and being able to either work out of position or control the position enough to get the submission. And speaking of those, he seems to have a variety of those to throw. His striking echoes a bit of what I've been saying a lot this card already, with a grappler striking total, a 2.99 to a 3.50. While he does have some power lurking, it's not always a reliable draw for him, only 4 KO wins in his last 12 total wins. Jackson is similar in the overall numbers, with 15 career submission wins, but only 2 overall in the UFC. And honestly, he's a bit of a weird one to get a hold on. But I'll label him a kill-or-be-killed fighter, with most of his wins coming by finish or submission. He has been a bit inconsistent as of late, but in the numbers works a 2.90 to 3.47 in striking. He doesn't tend to pull away all that much when he does lead in the strikes, and in his losses we see him get outpaced relatively solidly in a good number of them. He does have power, but as mentioned, it's a little inconsistent. Now, his takedowns are a little more consistent, with a 2.34 average. But we have seen him land takedowns but still lose the fight since he wasn't able to convert multiple successful takedowns into enough control time or a submission win. Additionally, he has been able to work off his opponent's takedowns to secure victories, but also has been controlled in turn on the ground. Damon Jackson is the narrow recipient of Vegas' endorsement here, and I think I'm going to take a chance and disagree. Yes, Miller is older, but with both fighters being ground focused, my choice here is based on how they handle being taken down. And historically, it looks like Miller has handled it a little better and has been able to get control time back in turn or make use of defensive submissions, which in my mind gives him more of a chance to win this fight when paired up with Damon Jackson. 16-7, Chris All-American Weidman takes the octagon against 16, 8, 0-1, Eric ya boy Anders. Anders is 3 years younger at 37. Weidman steals 1 inch in height and 3 in reach. Weidman is very much a rounded fighter, with some powerful striking and a solid ground game he can use to win rounds or disrupt his opponent's offense. In terms of the striking, he works a 3-1-8 to a 3-2-2, which does speak to his willingness to step in and swing with his opponent. However, this has worked against him with some fighters taking control or putting him away with power. Now, he does have finishability, but his last KO win came in 2015. Going to the ground game, it does exist as a pretty consistent presence in his wins with a 3.44 average. He doesn't tend to get the finish off though, but is able to rack up chunks of control time. Anders is a control-focused fighter with a solid ground game, but definitely excelled in slowing the fight down and limiting what his opponent is able to do. Takedown average hits at 1.79, which speaks to how he doesn't have to shoot them to gain control time in the octagon. But when he does shoot them, he's able to rack up several minutes off of a single takedown. His ground control can be negated or minimized, but as a whole, it's fairly consistent. Now, with his striking, he runs a 3-4-1 to 4-1-7, which shows how he slows down the fight and keeps the overall totals relatively low. It does play into his ability to rack up control time without a takedown, though we have seen him get outpaced and overcome on the feet. Anders is the narrow favorite in this match, and honestly, I deliberated over this a good deal. Weidman brings a solid style and the ability to match up with most of his opponents in both aspects of the game. Anders brings a controlling ground game that forces you to beat him there in order to force him to the feet. And I think because of that, I'm going to go with Anders. Yes, Weidman has a good ground game. I just think Anders' controlling style and ability to slow the fight down gives him the slight edge in that regard, which then raises the question, can Anders survive on the feet? And he's done that before against other fighters. So I think Weidman has a much harder path to victory than Anders does in this fight. Taking us out of these prelims, 19-5, Jonathan Dragon Martinez squares up against 9-1, Marcus the Maniac McGhee. Martinez is 4 years younger, rather 1 inch in height going to McGhee, or dead even across the board, with the reach being a whole inch to Martinez. Now, Martinez is a striker capable of finishing the fight or controlling his opponent on the feet. He rocks a 4.54 to 3.87 with a fairly dynamic style capable of working in kicks and knees to catch his opponent in an instant. He tends to hold a decent striking lead in most of his fights and maintains the explosiveness in those later rounds. Now, this is backed with a solid ground game. The actual takedown percentage is only a 0.41, which speaks to how he doesn't often want to head to the ground. But looking at his fight against Said Nurmagomedov, he was able to overcome 3 takedowns against to gain 6 minutes of control time in turn. McGhee is a relative newcomer with 3 UFC fights, but is undoubtedly a finisher with all 9 of his wins coming by finish, a KO, 1 submission. Looking at his UFC numbers, he's a fairly high-octane striker with a 5.43 to 2.52 on the feet, which shows how quickly he's able to build that striking lead across 2 rounds. He does have a .84 takedown average, but only has 1 takedown across 3 UFC fights for 1:47 of ground control. Vegas gives the small edge to McGhee, and I think I'm going to disagree. This fight's an absolute toss-up. Both guys are finishers. Both guys are capable of ending the fight like that. So I'm going to give the edge to UFC experience, which Martinez takes here. Martinez has more UFC fights and more UFC wins than McGhee does. Can McGhee win this fight? Yeah, both guys are finishers. Both guys can take their block off in a second. But I'm just going to give Martinez the slight edge, given that he has fought more in the UFC. Kicking off the main card. The Fighting Nerds' Mauricio Ruffy looks to go another 3 in a row in the UFC against 14-4 Goku Llontop. Llontop is 3 years younger, 1 inch taller, with 2 inches in reach, going to Ruffy. Ruffy doesn't have a whole lot of UFC stats, but in his career, the man is undoubtedly a finisher with 10 career KO wins. I don't know the nature of his striking, but I imagine he's able to work in some athleticism and general explosiveness to close the distance and deal massive chunks of damage. In the UFC, his stats are a 4.88 to 3.80 in striking, which does highlight how willing he is to step in against his opponents. This has only backfired against him once, so his chin seems pretty decent. Llontop has been struggling these last 2 UFC fights, with both being losses, but to move on from that. Stylistically, very much a striker. Now, what is difficult to gauge is his finishability. He has no finishes in the UFC, and his last KO came in 2023 outside the UFC. It does seem to be a dynamic style with kicks mixed in with the punches, and he has also been submitted twice, both by rear naked chokes, so the ground game might also be a weakness here. The heavy favorite is Ruffy, and I think I'm just going to agree. Obviously, 1 point in favor is the 2-fight losing streak of Llontop being the cold hand coming in versus the hot hand of Ruffy. The other part of it is the high-octane striking of Ruffy and how Llontop's proven the willingness to wade into fights, despite that not working for him previously. We see other fighters wade in, eat punches, and swing back with power. Llontop hasn't been able to find his power in the UFC, and I don't know if he's going to be able to find it here against someone like Ruffy, who's had that hot hand and had the power going with his fights. 12-6 Viviane Araujo takes on 18-4 Karine Killer Silva. Silva is 7 years younger at 30, either 1 inch shorter or taller, or even dead across the board because both sides got the height different for both fighters, with reach being nice and simple, inch for Araujo. Araujo is a grinder pure and simple. She controls the fight with swaths of control time that limit the offense of her opponents and let her get the decision win. She mainly does this through takedowns with a 1.76 takedown average, with all but one of her UFC wins having her landing 2 or more takedowns for chunks of control time. It is worth noting that we do have examples of her being unable to control her opponent, or her takedowns being neutralized, resulting in a loss in turn. Her striking is very much a functional at best, a 4.11 to a 4.96. It's good enough to let her get to the ground and deal some damage, but we do also see her get thoroughly outpaced on the feet and unable to make up the difference on the ground. Silva is completely different and very much resembles a submission-focused finisher, with all but one of her UFC wins being by that method. Starting with the ground game, she rolls a 3.59 takedown average and the ability to stack takedowns if she's unable to land her submission. Now, she has been submitted twice, but in this fight, I'm not sure if Araujo is going to be a threat in that way. Striking is once again a grappler style with a 2.67, 3.12, good enough to land some shots, but entirely exists to help her set up a takedown. Vegas rolls with Silva here, and I'm going to agree. Araujo can be taken down, and looking at Silva, you see an effective and dangerous ground game that she can both take control time or sink the submission. Yes, it is a bit of a gamble, but with how Araujo doesn't finish, that simply gives Silva more time in the cage and more rounds to either work for the finish or work the ground game and get the control time for. 6-0 Bo Nickal tries to keep the 0 against 17-8-1 Paul Bearjew Craig. Nickal is 8 years younger, 2 or 3 inches shorter, with a dead draw in reach. Now, Nickal's a finisher with the majority of his wins coming by submission, but no fights have gone to decision. He very much has a ground focus like a lot of other fighters on this card. His takedown average is a little inflated based on how quickly he gets out of most of his fights, but it does sit at 7.46 with the ability to build chunks of control time if the submission doesn't sink. His striking totals are also pretty low given his lack of time in the octagon, so the numbers are 1.64 to 0.50, which has been mostly functional to set up the ground game. Craig is similar in terms of being a finisher with a really good ground game that can do a lot of damage, but also has struggled as of late in terms of getting his consistent finish, as he has only had 1 win out of his last 6 fights. He's got a 1.86 takedown average, which does speak to his ability to initiate the action and take it down, but worth noting is his ability to play off his back. In turn, there are times he will go down or play out of guard. This does open up a lot of dangerous possibilities against opponents who don't keep that fact in mind. Looking at his striking, it sits at a 2.45 to 2.97, which highlights the effective nature and power that he's able to bring out at times, though he can also be caught in turn. Nickal is the heavy favorite, and I think I will agree. It's not that Craig is sitting dead to rights, but in the last few fights I've watched, he seemed very willing to play off the back. He seemed really willing to cede the position and try to work out of guard. Now, with someone like Nickal, who's proven to be very good on the ground, very good at controlling the flow, controlling the action, and able to control from the top, that seems very dangerous. Can Craig change the game plan? Yes, I think he gets more dangerous doing it. But I am going to run with Vegas. I am going to run with Nickal, given how I've seen Craig fight in some of his last few fights. For the co-main event, 34-10-1, Charles "Du Bronx" Oliveira looks to rebound quick against the 23-9 Iron Michael Chandler. Oliveira is 3 years younger, 2 inches taller, with 3 inches in reach, also going his way. Oliveira has been featured a few times on this series, and I really don't feel that my description of him ever really changes that much. He's a well-rounded fighter, capable of taking the fight to the ground, securing the finish, or landing the KO blow on the feet. Now, his striking isn't that great, a 3.39 to 3.20, but he's able to hang in against most of his opponents and set up his ground game with it. He does have a KO touch, but it's not so much straight power as it is landing at the right time with the right shot, which does lend some inconsistency to its appearance, but you also can't count it out in any given fight. Going to his ground game, he carries a 2.17 average, which speaks to his tendency to lead the action on takedowns and try to have control. Off of those takedowns, he can land submissions, but a lot of time he will get them off scrambles and defensive maneuvers that adds another wrinkle to his game. Worth noting is also the fact that while he's able to play off his back, other skilled fighters have taken control from him. Chandler is a rounded fighter with the ability to deal damage on the feet and work in some smart wrestling. It, however, hasn't really translated over to the win column, with his only UFC wins in his return, and not counting Strikeforce, are Dan Hooker and Tony Ferguson. Looking at the feet first, he works a 4.89 to 4.58, which highlights his willingness to engage with his opponents and wade into fire. He does have decent power, but just has been beat by other finishers. He does have some serious athleticism to mix in devastating kicks and other explosive attacks. Looking at his ground game, he carries a 2.17 takedown average that he's been able to use as disruption in good chunks of control time in a few fights. Oliveira is the favorite by a decent margin, and I did deliberate a little bit, but I will agree here. Chandler did well the first fight. He controlled that first round with some really good smart wrestling, kept Oliveira on the back foot, but then the second round happened and he lost. And I think if we're comparing styles, I think Oliveira matches up stylistically very well with Chandler. He has the physical advantages as well. And I think in this fight, I trust Oliveira to beat Chandler more than I trust Chandler to overcome all those disadvantages and beat Oliveira in what is essentially a rematch of that original fight. I don't think either fighter has evolved incredibly or added completely new levels to their game, so I'm going to give the nod back to Oliveira. For the main event and the fight we all really wanted, 27-1-0-1, Jon Bones Jones looks to defend the heavyweight belt against former champion 20-4 Stipe Miocic. Jones is younger by 5 years at 37 with dead even height but 4 inches of reach, rolling to Jones. Alright, now forgive my apathy for this fight, but Jones is an incredibly dangerous fighter with a tendency to be a finisher, but has the ability to take it to the judges, especially with 3 of his last 5 going the distance. I don't want to call him a striker since he has solid wrestling and takedown ability, but striking is a major strength of his. Game with wrestling serving to limit his opponent's offense and give him some good control time. Looking at the striking alone, he carries a 4.29 to a 2.22, which shows he's able to work his style well and limit a lot of damage coming back his way. And as mentioned, his takedown game is a solid backup that makes itself known consistently, putting other fighters on the back foot with 1.93 average. Now, his takedown game has been shut down or minimized before against Reyes and Santos. Miocic is a solid fighter with a decently rounded skill set. Striking is very much a major part of his wheelhouse with a 4.82 to 3.82, where he has been able to bring his power from a variety of positions and situations. But like Jones, there's a lurking takedown and control game behind it all. Now, with Miocic, it is a little more situational and matchup based than I feel Jones is. As such, it has been shut down or rendered ineffective against other opponents. I still have nightmares over that Ngannou fight where he shot, it got defended, and then he got murdered the second round. A 1.86 average highlighting that fact is a fair amount. Vegas favors Jones, and that is honestly the correct pick to make. But I will be damned if I don't pick Stipe Miocic to win this fight. Yes, the pick is objectively wrong, but with a hope and a prayer that Old Man Magic can come in and he'll find some sort of power to make this an even fight, I'm picking Miocic to win this thing based on that unearned optimism. So in the end, and after that last little burst of mania, that's UFC 309. Overall, it's a fine card. Yes, I'm still a little apathetic given the main event, but I think throughout it you have some interesting contenders coming up, some fighters looking to prove it, some fighters looking to establish. Oliveira Chandler should be a fun fight. Those guys went at it the first time and gave us an exciting finish. I'd like to imagine the second fight will do the same. I think Paul Craig Bo Nickal is a fight that has a lot of things at stake, if not the most exciting fight on paper. And I think top to bottom, you're going to see some interesting fights pop off, and you're going to see some interesting fighters looking to establish them. But in the end, those were my picks. Go ahead and leave a comment, tell me what you think I got wrong, what you think I got right, and what you thought of the video. Thank you very much, and have a great fight.